My son's words were like a knife. I don't want to feed an extra mouth. He told me I had to go to work. I could only smile, nod, and take along a light bulb and a blue thermos. In the Ohio night, I didn't resist. I just quietly fixed the cracked step, the worn hinge, and the broken porch light. If the house no longer has cracks, no longer holds a risk of tripping, will that warm golden light be enough to mend a wound in the heart and bring back someone who has gone? The kitchen is as silent as if holding its breath. The wall clock ticks forward in slow notches, the second hand passing across the stripe of its own shadow on the old glazed tiles, leaving little ticks to lie between the steady breathing of the refrigerator. He lays the newly received retirement card on the table, the plastic still smelling new, the embossed letters gleaming under a late blade of sun next to an enamel-flaked coffee pot, its spout chipped a corn kernel's size. An old coffee ring still circles the tabletop, paled by many wipings. He presses a dry cloth down, gives a light twist, the faint circle flattening as if into a deliberate accent, then disappearing. He drags the wooden chair closer, its legs scraping dryly over the floor, and sits, his hands layered, thumb stroking the card's edge back and forth. In his head, the imagined evening appears like a film frame. Glasses tapping softly, a spoon touching the side of a cup, eyes meeting and then turning away out of shyness, and somewhere a sentence blooming warm enough. "I'm proud of you, Dad." From the words proud of, a warm current threads from his throat down into his chest. He almost smiles, the corner of his mouth lifting like emotion not used in a long while, then stops, as if someone had just touched his shoulder. On the shelf, the family photo taken 10 years ago tilts a little. He stands, reaches to straighten it. In the picture, the backyard grass is still green. The boy is hugging a football, grinning through a gap-toothed smile. The woman beside him rests a hand on her husband's shoulder, pale polish on her nails, a strip of sun cutting across her hair into threads as fine as silk. He looks a long time, long enough to see that the crow's feet at his own eyes were then still fine and gentle. He presses a fingertip to the glass and pushes lightly. The glass is cold enough to make him shiver. The smile from a moment ago goes out without a sound, like a lamp flickering once in a gust and then holding steady, only darker. He adds water to the pot. The stream spills in a filament through the spout, breaks at the chipped spot, and falls as several drops that run quickly down the scratched metal body. He takes a cloth and dabs it up. The familiar smell of coffee, threaded with old paint and laundry, hung to dry in clammy weather, makes the kitchen feel like the hold of a boat moored too long at the dock, no longer going to sea. He opens the window a crack, just enough for a draft to slip through, drawing a shimmer of fine dust before the afternoon light. Far off, a dog's bark echoes over a fence. Children call to one another and fall quiet at the end of the street as if someone had accidentally turned a knob down. He takes 2 porcelain cups, sets them on the table, then puts one back on the shelf. He changes his mind and takes it out again. He places them a hand's breadth apart, then draws them closer so that one faces the other, so that when he looks down, he sees his own face, slightly canted, reflected in the glaze at the bottom. He imagines himself filling both cups, setting the retirement card between them like a marker for a stretch of road, and waiting for familiar footsteps to pass by the kitchen and stop. He imagines a casual word of praise, a glancing touch to the shoulder, a sitting that goes on 5 minutes longer. In the imagining, the movements are very small and exactly in place, like screws tightened after years of looseness. The phone on the table gives a faint buzz. The screen lights and goes dark with nothing new. Only the weather notification slides across. It may be cold tonight. He unlocks it, types a few words into the empty message field, tonight, then deletes them. The cursor blinks at the head of the line like someone standing at a threshold, unsure whether to step in. He locks the phone and lays it face down, a finger lingering an instant longer than needed, as if afraid it might slide away. He turns back to the card, sets it a distance from the coffee pot exactly the width of his palm. The plastic surface reflects the veins on the back of his hand, faint bluish lines rising like a map of rivers. He thinks of mornings waking before dawn, the habit of cold water on his face to sharpen him. And yet, today, warm water made his skin twitch as if it were strange. He flips the card over and back, the thumb tracing the slightly blunted sharp corner worn from a day in his pocket, the card unexpectedly light in the hand, as if the long road were at last packed into a small piece of plastic. The fluorescent tube overhead blinks twice and settles. He looks up, fixing on a spot near the end of the tube where a thin skin of dust throws a dingy yellow halo. He pulls the chair over, stands to touch it. His finger comes away dusty. He brushes it on his trouser leg, leaving a pale gray streak on the faded blue fabric. He thinks of a very small task. Wipe away that murky halo, tighten the socket, just that, and the light would hold steadier. The thought slips by like a small fish, but leaves a ripple in the water. The coffee pours with a tack, tack, steam lifting thin as smoke. He raises the cup merely to smell it, then sets it down. Outside, the sun drops another notch behind the birches. The tree's shadows stretch long across the back steps, creeping to the table legs. He pulls the tablecloth straight, smoothing the center crease from one edge to the other, the even motion like someone polishing a sentence to make it flow. A trace of detergent lingers. He lays the spoon on the right, turns its handle to 4 o'clock. Everything sits still as on a draft. He tilts his head, takes in the whole once more. From that slant, the empty space in the opposite chair looks larger than he thought. It is not empty because no one sits there. It is empty because the one who would sit there, if they did, would bring a different weather with them. He returns to the photo. In the lower corner, the backing paper has yellowed, a dry seam of glue spreading like an old water stain. He rubs it smooth. His hand stops at the boy's face in the picture. "I'm proud of you, Dad." The line he had laid aside for someone suddenly feels far away, like sound heard through a thick door, the words still recognizable, the warmth immeasurable. He lets his hand drop. The old smile folds in, not because someone has just denied him, but because he now sees something else more clearly. The tiny detail at his mouth's corner in the photo, a crease that does not exist in the present. He goes back to his seat. A drop of coffee falls from the spout, touches the card, and slides to the edge like a black ant. He dabs it at once with the cloth, dries it, then lifts the card to the light again. His name is still clear. He sets the card down carefully, adjusts the distance between card and cup by 1/2 centimeter. From down the hallway, there are no footsteps, no door. The kitchen keeps the shape it has always had. Everything in its place as it has been for years, with one thing still without a place, where he will put himself in this evening. He spreads his hand over the tabletop, palm resting on the cup's thin warmth. For a few seconds, he thinks he can still hear the clink of glasses, a very slight sound, perhaps only living in memory. Then the clock inserts itself again, stepping evenly. He exhales. His breath meets the porcelain and dissolves quietly. The smile does not return. He sits a while longer, listening to the old kitchen take a minute slowly in stride. Somewhere inside him, a string has just been tied, not tightened, only knotted. He reaches and squares the card one last time, setting it to stand beside the old enamel-flaked coffee pot, like two objects long acquainted, waiting for a night that may arrive or not. Then he lays his other hand on his knee, the palm open, and waits until the second hand makes 2 more circuits. Only then does he give a slight nod, as if to confirm to himself that the night, whatever it becomes, will still have light in the kitchen. He rose from the kitchen table as if he had just remembered a small task that had been left undone. It wasn't urgent, but if he didn't do it now, it would make him restless. He walked slowly down the hallway, the wood under his sandals rasping in a very thin, rustling sound. The door of the last room opened. The smells of old fabric and dry wood mingled. The yellow ceiling light spread over the single bed with a checked blanket. The pillow was dented in the middle like the fingerprint of time. A fine plume of dust fanned out from the wardrobe when he pulled the bottom drawer. He lifted a shirt off its hanger. The cloth had grown so soft that with just a pass of the hand the folds settled into place. The collar was frayed, little threads like white whiskers showing along the edge. He ran a fingertip along that frayed line, the bristly familiar feel. He laid the shirt on the bed, smoothed one sleeve up to the shoulder, then the other, his movements unhurried and careful, like someone folding up an old afternoon. He fastened the top button so the collar would close, the frayed spot less on display. His fingers fumbled at the last button, but he managed to secure it. He folded the body of the shirt in three, hiding the worn collar inside. The creases squared so precisely that edge matched edge. When he finished, he set his palm on the fabric, holding for a few seconds so the folds would lie still. A slow breath slipped out, enough to make the little protruding thread at the cuff quiver very slightly. He didn't cut it. He left it, as a way to know there was still a spot to tack down next time. He opened the drawer. Inside was a stack of other clothes, tidy yet a little lacking in color. He placed the shirt in one corner, pressed it down lightly to lower it, so it sat snug like a notebook returned to its rightful empty slot. His hand paused at the lip of the drawer, held a beat, then pushed it in. A soft clack of wood touching wood sounded, neat and final. He looked around. The photo of his late wife stood upright on a small table in an old wooden frame, the glass scored by a scratch running across her eyelashes. He touched the tip of his finger to that mark and wiped once. It didn't come off. He didn't try again. On the armchair lay a coat from another era, its pocket still bearing the old habit of bulging because there was always a little roll of mints in it back then. He turned the pocket out empty. He smoothed it flat, set the coat on the chair back, hiding the wrinkles to the inside. Back in the kitchen, he stood at the threshold a moment so his eyes could readjust to the light. The table still held 2 cups as when he'd left. He took one, gave it a rinse, set it upside down on the rack. Water dripped, dotting a patch of the tablecloth. With the other, he tipped the mouth of the cup to let it dry, then set it in its old spot only a little farther in. The shift was so small, but enough that the cup no longer stood out on the table. He pulled his chair close to the edge, measuring the distance to the table with his palm, just right so that when he sat, his seat touched the chair, but his knees didn't hit the underside. He tried sitting and standing, checking for the creak of the chair legs. No sound. He nodded, as if he had just tightened an old screw. On the fridge, a shopping list was pinned under an apple-shaped magnet. Milk, detergent, tissues, fruit, nothing he usually used. He gazed at it for a while, took the pencil by the phone, and wrote coffee in small letters along the bottom margin, then erased it at once, leaving a smudged gray streak. He put the pencil away. The paper looked clean as before. The emptiness in the erased corner felt like a footprint quickly blurred by wind out in the yard. He opened the cupboard, took a small plate, and set it in the middle of the spot where he usually sat. On the plate, he laid a stainless steel spoon with its handle pointing to the right, not for anyone to use tonight, but as a reminder to himself that someone here once sat thinking about the morning. He smoothed the table runner again, even the creases no one would ever notice. The gesture flattened the cloth. The surface grew calm. Outside on the porch, wind brushed the little chime hanging from the eave, making a very thin sound before it stopped. He went to the doorstep and tested the porch switch on and off. Yellow light slanted down onto the steps in a slightly skewed trapezoid. Dust on the shade made the light dull, but still showed the edge of the lowest step was slightly chipped. He bent down, ran his hand along that chip. Dust clung to his fingertips. He flicked it lightly against his pant leg. The thought of repairing it flared and then went out on its own, like an intention whose turn hadn't yet come. Back at the table, he pulled the chair one more time, a shift almost imperceptible, but it settled him. He opened the upper cupboard, took a cloth napkin with frayed edges, folded it in 4 and set it on the table's edge, right where his right forearm usually rested when he ate. The small napkin was like a quiet marker. Tomorrow, he would only need to sit down and lay his arm there. To remember he still had a place. His phone lit up again with some trivial reminder. He didn't check it. He scooped a spoonful of coffee into the bottom of a cup without adding water. The dark grounds lay still in an uneven circle. He set the cup off-center, leaving a small gap for someone to pass without bumping into it. He wiped his hands on the dish towel, hung it back on its old hook, the towel's edge facing the wall. The kitchen suddenly had a tighter order, not to welcome a meal, but to welcome an ordinary morning. Inside him, the swollen hope of an evening of raised glasses had collapsed into something neat. Tomorrow morning, a place for himself, a chair pulled out that made no sound, a cup waiting to be filled, a spoon pointing the right way. That was all. He switched off an extra lamp, leaving only the light over the table. The yellow band wrapped the chair like a thin coat. He stood looking for a long time, until his eyelids grew warm. There were no tears, only breath going in and out, even as a clock. He set his hand on the cot's chair back, pressed very lightly, as if sending a message to the wood. Remember to hold me tomorrow. Then he turned away, lifted the chipped enamel coffee pot and set it deeper into the corner so it wouldn't take the place of anything else. The kitchen door closed behind him, the latch touching the frame with a small sigh. On the other side of the door, the chair still faced the table. The cloth napkin was still folded in four, the spoon still pointed right. Everything had settled into a quiet agreement. If no one said anything at breakfast, at least there would still be a seat waiting for him. Exactly placed, exactly silent. His room was at the end of the hallway, the door a thin sheet of wood. Each time it opened, the smell of old fabric and dry wood wafted out, and a fine dust drifted like thin smoke in the yellow light. The single bed stood against the wall, the checkered blanket folded neatly at the foot, the pillow dented into a small hollow just the size of a head's imprint. Beside the bed was a low, wooden table, its edge with peeling paint, holding a framed photo of his late wife, her hair clipped tidily back, her eyes slightly squinted against the sun. Behind the glass, a slender scratch ran diagonally across the picture like a misplaced white thread. Every morning, before the alarm sounded, he was already awake. He sat on the edge of the bed, both feet on the wooden floor, still a little cold, his fingertips tracing a small crack that ran along the plank. He folded the blanket, smoothed out the creases, lifted the pillow and shook it lightly so the filling settled evenly, then set it back exactly into the old hollow. The movements were slow and orderly, as a way to remind himself there was still something within reach. He poured water into a small aluminum kettle kept in the corner of the room, an old kettle he had brought in from the kitchen long ago. To spare himself the walk early in the morning, the water ticked into a boil, the lid trembling slightly. He opened the tin of coffee grounds. A faint aroma rose. He scooped not quite a full spoon, just enough for the water to turn a light brown. The thin coffee ran past a chipped line of glaze at the cup's rim, a light steam lifting to blur the picture frame on the table for a moment. He blew on it softly. The breath blended with the gentle tapping of the lid against the metal body, as if soothing it. The small window in the corner was loosely shut, its hinges giving a squeak if tugged hard. He set the cup down, gripped the wooden sash and pushed it ajar, leaving a gap just wide enough for the morning air to slip through. The cool, faint draft brought in the smell of the backyard, the damp earth lingering from the night, dry leaves, sometimes even a catch of laundry detergent from someone who'd just hung their clothes. He stood angled to the window, leaning an arm on the sill, and listened for a while. The distant traffic on the main road, like a steady river, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, a vague train horn from somewhere, blocked by rooftops, the clipped thud of tires grinding through a pothole at the turn 2 blocks away. Day after day, those sounds had taken the place of morning greetings. He no longer hoped to hear his name called. It was enough to have the passing cars tell him others were still going. He took a sip. The light bitterness faded quickly on his tongue, leaving a bit of warmth in his throat. On the table, the frame stood upright. He drew it half a centimeter closer, then wiped the glass with the hem of his shirt. The scratch remained. It could not be blurred away. He paused, his fingertip on the woman's cheek in the photo for a second, as if testing the chill of the glass. Then he slid a handkerchief underneath the frame, so it wouldn't shift each time he brushed it by accident. The wooden wardrobe against the wall opened with a familiar creak. Shirts hung on their hooks, each spaced evenly. Their colors washed out into the pale tones of time. He slid his hand between the layers of cloth, drew out a thin shirt, checked the frayed cuff, then hung it back. In the bottom drawer was a small box of odds and ends, needles, thread, two buttons fallen from some winter long ago, the old leather strap of a watch. He picked up a white thread, let it run through the tangled feel of his fingertips, then set it down. Not yet. By the window, the early light crept in by degrees, reached the bed's edge, and revealed a few dust motes turning in the air. He pulled a plastic chair close to the window, set the cup on the sill, leaned back, and kept listening to the street's far-off refrain, the school bus braking hard at the curve, the door popping open with a soft psh, the clatter of someone dragging a trash bin, now and then a bird stamping on the corrugated roof with a light tapping sound. All of it wove into something so familiar that if it disappeared, he would notice. He kept time more by those sounds than by the hands of a clock. On the wall, only a few pages of the tear-off calendar remained, the corner curling up. He took a pencil and drew a thin line through today's square. No notes, just a stroke to know he had passed through the day. On the table, the cup rested on a round rattan coaster already worn. The rim had a spot where fibers flared like a tiny hook that snagged his shirt whenever he swept his hand past without thinking. He turned the coaster, hiding the frayed spot to the inside. On days with wind, the thin gingham curtain trembled as if breathing. On days without, the room was quiet as a shell. He was used to both. Sometimes he held the old clock to his ear, listening to the ticks closer, to crowd the empty space. Sometimes he bent to pick up a white hair fallen on the tabletop, twined it around his fingertip, and dropped it into the trash, trifling gestures that helped the morning move to some sort of rhythm. From the kitchen, there would sometimes echo the thunk-thunk of a plastic lid snapped shut in haste, or the clink of a spoon against a bowl, sounds belonging to a different tempo, faster, busier. He seldom intruded. He liked to keep his cup of coffee here, in the room at the end of the corridor where the far-off traffic supplied a backdrop. The thin smell of coffee, the dry wood scent, the morning air mixed into a fragrance he knew so well that, upon opening his eyes, he could feel it there, like a friend standing still. When he finished drinking, he set the cup upside down to dry, wiped the damp from the sill with a cloth, and pulled the window nearly shut, leaving a small crack. He straightened the picture frame again, a repeated habit, then sat on the bed and rubbed his knees lightly before standing. The day would not begin with any conversation, but with a set of distant sounds that recognized one another. Traffic, wind chimes, the faint burr of someone's water pipe, the tap of a bird on the roof. They stood in for good morning, the inquiries long absent, and somehow they were still enough for him to know he existed in this house, even at the end of the hall. The living room opened like a small stage that was always lit. The wall-mounted TV blazed, the canned laughter of a sitcom breaking in steady bursts, mixing with bouncy ad music. Below the screen, a low shelf was piled with power strips and cords, remotes, a few paper cups not yet thrown away. A streak of dried soda on the glass tabletop left a sticky brown ring. In the middle of the table lay stacks of debt papers clamped with black binder clips. Utilities, credit card, car loan, insurance, each stack held by its own clip, the clip's mouth slightly bent from overuse. The more important sheets had neon sticky notes on them, the rushed handwriting crammed in, the numbers listing at angles. The son sat tucked into the corner of the sofa, laptop open, a spreadsheet dense with cells, the due date column glowing red in the nearest rows, the phone in his hand lit up in little pops with a string of bank notifications. Payment received, minimum due, statement ready. His other hand flipped through each bill, his index finger tapping short beats on the table edge as if to bleed off tension. Beside him, the daughter-in-law curled her legs up on the seat, a throw pillow clutched to her chest. hair tied high with a thin elastic. She swiped a highlighter back and forth over tiny lines, the yellow leaving a thin, bright furrow on the paper, then set the pen down, opened a budgeting app, and dragged her finger across the blue bars. Groceries, gas, internet, medicine, every column hitting the limit. The TV erupted in a long peal of laughter when a character slipped and fell. The daughter-in-law laughed on reflex and then swallowed it back, her eyes still fixed on the premium line ticking up. The son leaned over, pulled out a bigger binder clip to gather a pile of past due into one. The rubber band cinched around the bundle snapped with a dry twang. On the table, a small glass jar for spare change, used to tip delivery drivers, held only a scatter of low-denomination bills, lying among scuffed coins. Each small crease on his forehead seemed deeper, like pencil lines drawn straight down to his mouth and cheekbones. He passed by carrying the smell of weak coffee freshly poured. He stopped at the threshold. The living room air was warmer and thicker than the kitchen. A breath of dinner still lodged in the carpet. The TV cast a bluish wash over their faces, turning the edges of objects into cold lines. The son glanced up for a second, the look skimming past like a nod, then turned back to the screen. The daughter-in-law also lifted her eyes a little, her lips parting as if to say something and then not. Her wrist hugged the pillow tighter. The highlighter spun once in her hand and dropped to lie diagonally across the edge of a bill. He set his coffee cup down at the table's edge, a little away from the paper stacks, afraid of getting them wet. The cup wobbled slightly, kissed the glass with a faint squeak, and left a cloudy, damp ring. He reached to pick up a bill that had slid off its pile. The numbers showed, last month, plus a late fee. He held the sheet out to the daughter-in-law. She took it with the tips of 2 fingers, pinching exactly the paper's edge, avoiding touching his hand without making a show of it. He drew his hand back, nodded briefly, and stepped half a pace away. An insurance commercial came on. A bright female voice talking about peace of mind, a young couple smiling on a lawn, the wind puffing their shirts. On the sofa, the son turned the laptop slightly to avoid the TV's glare, inadvertently also turning it away from him. His fingers flicked fast, blacking out a few cells, entering a number he had just calculated. That quick motion sounded like a sewing machine needle running straight over taut fabric. He lingered a moment more, looking at the remote lying askew near the edge, his son's thumb resting on it by habit. He meant to lay his hand on his son's shoulder, a light touch, like in the years before, but the distance between them was short and long at once. As his hand moved closer, the son suddenly turned to reach for another stack of papers, an innocuous motion, but his father's hand brushed his elbow and paused there, a beat slow. The son drew his elbow back and set it on the pillow, as if remembering he still had one more column left to sum. The daughter-in-law held out her phone for her husband to see a screen, a small red badge in the corner of the banking app, the digits changing color from black to purple. She tugged her sleeve to cover more of her wrist when he stood near, then leaned to grab the disinfectant spray on the table. The pump gave a soft click. A thin smell of alcohol spread into the lingering food smell and the plastic smell of the remote. He slid his cup closer to himself to leave room and pulled a small stool over from the wall. The scrape of its legs on the floor drowned out the TV for a beat. Then the canned laughter flowed back in to fill the gap. He sat on the edge of the stool, both hands around the cup as if to keep something from slipping. On the table, a bill printed with minimum payment lay folded in half and off-kilter, the edge of the paper curled from too many touches. His eyes passed over that row of words the way someone walks past a familiar shop without the money to go in. They laughed again when, on screen, a character opened the wrong door. The laughter spread through the living room like foam, touched him and burst. The son pressed his hand to his forehead and rubbed once around, while the other hand stayed on the mouse, dragging cells. The daughter-in-law gathered the marked bills into a neat stack, aligned the edges, and stroked the corner with her fingernail, the faint rustle sounding like a sigh. He set his hand on the sofa arm to stand, his fingertips brushing the fabric. The daughter-in-law startled slightly, pulled the pillow up a bit more. The space between her elbow and his hand widened at once. Like a reflex, he drew his hand back and smiled, a smile aimed at nothing, like a gesture of asking leave. He lifted the cup. The thin coffee smell couldn't overpower the just sprayed alcohol. Before he turned away, he instinctively slid a paper napkin under the cup so it wouldn't wet the tabletop. A small kitchen habit brought in here, like an effort to keep things from spilling beyond their bounds. By the time he reached the threshold, the TV had switched to a short mid-break news bulletin. The ticker at the bottom flickered about interest rates and gas prices. The son looked up just as he caught his father's silhouette reflected in the glass door. He nodded again, very slightly. The father answered with a motion almost too small to see. A fingertip touched the door, then withdrew. The door stayed ajar, letting the laughter and the numbers continue inside, like a language he no longer belonged to. In the hallway, the fluorescent tube hummed, breathing out a steady light with no laugh track cutting in. Between those two kinds of light, one cold, tangled white, one pale, quiet yellow, he walked slowly, the coffee tilted but not spilling, his hand loosely open, grazing the wall as if to remember the way back to the end of the hall. Dinner was laid out with the usual dishes, a bowl of soup cooled a little because someone was glued to the TV, a plate of dark braised meat, a bowl of boiled greens whose edges had wilted, a wicker basket of white rice steaming just enough that the steam was no longer clearly visible. A folded paper napkin sat under a spoon, a stainless steel spoon peeked out beneath the faintly flickering fluorescent tube. On the table, the glass jar of spare change from the living room had been moved over, lying askew like an embarrassed guest. He sat at the side of the table, near the wall, back not resting on the chair but held straight by long habit. He poured water for each person, tilting the pitcher carefully so it wouldn't spill and wet the rim of a bowl. The smell of mixed fish sauce thinned into the air. The daughter-in-law pulled her chair closer to her husband, her bowl lined up with the phone lying face down beside it. The son tapped his spoon twice against his bowl, not to call anyone but like a counting beat to steady himself. The TV in the living room was still on, the canned laughter drifting in like someone cheering outside a restaurant door. He waited until the clink of spoons and chopsticks subsided, choosing a lull he could pass his words through without bumping into anyone. He gave a small cough to lead into what he had to say, then looked at the tabletop to keep from trembling. "I've retired." The sentence was set down in the middle of the meal, like an extra bowl that suddenly appeared with no place to fit. There was a very thin silence, in which you could hear a water pipe squeal somewhere, and then stop. The daughter-in-law nudged her phone a bit farther away, her eyes still following the rim of the soup bowl. The son looked up, his gaze passing straight through him, as if toward the wall behind, then set his spoon down, his two fingers pinching together as if gripping a decision. "We can't feed an extra mouth. You have to work." The last sound of the word lamb bounced off the tiled floor, breaking into small pieces that settled in the corners of the room. The fork in his hand, lifting a piece of meat, suddenly slipped from his fingers and struck the porcelain plate with a crisp, bright note, then rolled to one side, the metal edge skimming a thin line across the glaze like a pencil stroke. That sound stretched longer than usual because the kitchen went quiet at exactly the moment it needed to. The TV in the living room also missed a beat, switching to an unusually hushed commercial segment, making the falling fork the only sound in the house. No one reached out a hand. The daughter-in-law started slightly and then pretended to reach for the bowl of greens, as if that fall had nothing to do with anything. The son held his pose, his two fingers still pinched on the tabletop, the vein on the back of his hand standing out like a taut cord. He looked at the fork, wanting both to pick it up and to leave it there, like someone standing before a door that has suddenly slammed shut and not knowing whether he has the right to open it again. His breath hitched once, tight in his throat. He set the hand still holding the spoon down on the napkin, his thumb unconsciously smoothing the crease. In the soup bowl before him, a few scallion leaves drifted, forming uneven ovals that touched and then parted. He lifted the bowl and sipped. The click of ceramic against his teeth was very faint. The broth was bland. He set the bowl back in its exact spot, gave it a slight turn so its rim ran parallel with the table's edge, a small habit to keep everything straight when his mind began to tilt. The son picked up a piece of meat and put it in his mouth without looking, the mechanical motion letting sauce drip onto the tablecloth in a dark round stain. He scraped it away with his spoon, leaving a smudge like someone had erased a word they didn't want to read. The daughter-in-law leaned over to pour more water into her glass. Droplets spattered along the rim so the glass glittered, and she wiped them at once with a fingertip, as carefully as cleaning a speck of dust on a phone screen. He bent to pick up the fork. His back crackled softly in a way only he could hear. His fingertips touched the cold metal, the fork tine stiff and inert as if laid bare by neglect. He set the fork along the edge of the plate, not plunging it back into the food. His hand still trembled. He laced his fingers together beneath the table's lip to hide it, and caught a glimpse of his nail worn down at one corner. On the wall, the clock moved into a new minute. The ticks measured out the silence. He lifted a stalk of greens and laid it in the daughter-in-law's bowl, an old habit of elders wanting to pass the good bits to the young. She smiled with her facial muscles, but kept her eyes from meeting his. Her bowl was already full. The stalk lay askew, one end resting on the rim, the other touching the edge of a spoon, as if it couldn't find a place to settle. She pushed it inward with her own spoon, a clean, wordless motion. The son raised his water glass and drank half, his throat swelling and subsiding, then set the glass down a shade too firmly. The sound of glass on tabletop reverberated, making the salt and pepper shakers quiver. He glanced through the doorway into the living room, where the TV showed a family laughing under a porch light. That light reflected in his pupils for a moment, but did not stay. He took the paper napkin, folded it into quarters, used the edge to dab at the drop of fish sauce that had just fallen from the spoon, wiping slowly until the surface of the table was dry again. The napkin grew damp at one corner. He turned it to a dry side, folded it once more, leaving the corner flat as new. The more meticulous his movements, the more clearly he could hear his heart beating. The sentence lying on the table hadn't been cleared away yet. It wasn't like the fallen fork. It had no teeth. It hadn't touched the porcelain glaze, but it lay in the middle of everything, making even the clink of utensils against each other awkward. The meal went on as if nothing had just been set down. The clatter of bowls and spoons returned. The TV again filled the kitchen with the voices of strangers. The daughter-in-law asked her husband with her eyes about this month's insurance. He nodded or shook his head in the smallest increments, enough for them to understand each other. He didn't intrude. He ate slowly, chewing the soft rice until it was like foam. Each time he lifted his spoon, he remembered to set it back in its old spot, like someone learning to walk again along chalked lines. When the meal was nearly over and only a few crumbs and a little soup remained on the table, he drew the bowls and plates toward himself to be ready to stand and carry them to the sink. The fork that had fallen earlier lay neatly along the edge of the last plate, clean enough to reflect the ridge of the ceiling light. He set his hand on the spine of the chair and stood slowly, pulling the chair close to the table so it wouldn't be in the way. No one stopped him, and no one asked him. Everything ran on in its chosen orbit. Only the smell of dish soap drifting from the sink mingled with fish sauce, making the kind of evening scent many households share. He carried the dishes to the sink and let the water run lightly so the clatter wouldn't sound too loud. Behind him, chairs scraped back into place. Slippers scuffed across the floor. The TV bumped up one notch to cover the gap. He didn't look back. His hand stroked the length of the fork under the tap, the tines touching his skin as a reminder. The water flowed in a steady strand, and the grease slid off the metal as quickly as the word "kongdi" just now had flowed out of the speaker's ear. When he set the fork on the drying rack, the last drop fell with a small tiki. The kitchen went quiet for a beat to hear that tiki. Then all the old sounds returned, as if nothing had ever been dropped except for a man standing by the sink, learning to breathe evenly with empty hands. No one picked anything up for anyone else. And his chair, by now, had been pulled a little closer to the table, just like the way he kept drawing himself in, so as not to take up anyone's space. Night gathered in the hallway like a thick strip of cloth. The door of the last room was ajar, the thin yellow from the fluorescent tube leaking into a long streak on the wooden floor, then fading as he turned off the switch. He lay on his side, facing the wall, his forehead against the cold paint. The smell of dry wood, the smell of a blanket washed many times, mingled with the damp of night. Here everything shrank small, the clock, the pipes, the refrigerator breathing steadily like a gentle animal. Out in the living room, the TV had been turned down. The host's voice had become a faraway mumble. Amid those fragile patches of quiet, a whisper slipped through the door crack like a thread. If he won't go to work, we'll have to figure something else out. The word else dropped to the floor, rolled once, and lay still somewhere under the table. He couldn't see it, but he heard it clearly, like hearing the lid of the spare change jar touch the edge of the table, a very thin sound that summoned its image exactly, emptier than before. He pulled the blanket over his head. His breath rebounded at once, warm for a few seconds, and then cooling quickly. His back went cold first, then his knees, then his ankles. He curled up a little tighter, his feet rubbing together, still not warm enough. His fingertips found the edge of the blanket, traced the binding where a section had come undone, touched the loose thread sticking out like a small white whisker. He held that thread, pinched between thumb and forefinger, and held it until his fingertips tingled numb. Outside, the broken whispering mixed with the plastic click of the remote and the soft squeak of the sofa as someone shifted. If he won't, the unfinished sentence stopped and stood at the hallway's bend. He swallowed dryly, his throat as parched as after walking a stretch of gravel. The dryness at his eyelids wasn't for lack of water. It was like a sheet of paper left too long in the sun, no longer soft enough to fold. No tears appeared. Somehow his body had refused to open the valve. He counted his breaths, the easiest and least costly counting he had left. 1, 2, 3, each beat passed through the thick blanket, touched his ear, and was gone. Each time he reached 4, figure something else out, shoved in like an uninvited period, tripping the count. He switched to counting the second hand, then gave up on that too, because the ticking sounded like someone else patiently waiting for him to answer something for which he had no words. On the small bedside table, the frame holding his late wife's photo caught a stray strip of light, cast in from the street through the gap in the curtain, crawled slowly across her cheek, then disappeared. He didn't turn to look. He knew that streak would come back whenever a car went by, just as he knew that by now in the kitchen, the spoon he had set pointing to the right still lay pointing right, growing cold. His seat for the morning, the chair he had pulled tight to the table's edge, rose in his mind like a small square on ruled paper without a name. He pressed lightly into the mattress, felt the foam sink and spring back, a pointless yielding. There was the sound of water dripping somewhere, maybe from the sink, maybe from a shower head not screwed tight. Each drop fell with a sound, even and stubborn, as if tapping on an invisible scale of patience. Downstairs, perhaps his son had stood to fetch more paper, slippers scuffed across the rug, then silence. He pictured his son's shadow passing the kitchen doorway, brushing the cup he had set off center to leave room, and passing by without touching it. He suddenly remembered he hadn't fully latched the drawer with the shirts he had just folded. That tiny thought ran through as a way to keep his mind from turning to something else. He meant to sit up, then didn't. The shift of his body under the blanket let a pocket of cold pour in, sharp at the nape of his neck. He lay still, listening to his breath open and close, like a door whose hinges had dried out. The TV switched to the late-night news. The name of a distant city was read out clearly. Low temperatures, scattered showers. His window gave a faint sound now and then when the wind slipped along the frame. The glass trembled with a small shiver like a spoon touching the rim of a cup. He tried to press his palm to his chest, pressing down so his heart would slow. His fingers brushed a pajama button with frayed thread. These scattered things, tonight, were suddenly stitched together by the thread of the voices out there. We'll have to figure something else out. Those slow 3 words lay right between his breastbone and his stomach, the place that usually grew light after his morning coffee. This time it was heavy, not heavy like an object set on him, heavy like a word lingering longer than it should. He tried to swallow that word with an imaginary sip of water. It would not go down. He turned further toward the wall, his face nearly pressed to the cold paint, hoping the cold would draw the heat from his head and quiet the words. A burst of canned laughter flared and went out. The living room door eased shut with a small push, the air in the house changing course, trailing a thin smell of disinfectant into the hallway. He knew the porch light out there still flickered on and off when the wind brushed the shade. The thin line of light under his door flickered along with it, breaking and joining again, just like the cadence of the talk in the living room. Coming, stopping, coming again. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to force himself to see nothing more. His dry eyelids met, making a faint rub like two sheets of paper, pressed face to face. No drop could squeeze through. He had used up everything he could use for the day. The strength to be surprised, the strength to argue, and the strength to cry. What remained was silence, thick as a blanket, but not warm like one. He pulled the edge of the blanket a little higher. His fingers found the frayed thread again and held it like someone gripping a thin balancing cord to cross the night. Far away, a car went by, sweeping a quick streak of light across the ceiling and gone. The air conditioner clicked on, then off. On the wall, the shadow of the picture frame quivered and stood still. He lay still, thinking of neither morning nor night. He only waited for that sentence to thin out like breath through the blanket. It did not thin. He kept waiting. And in that waiting, the clock went on, slow and steady, like the one person in the house who still remembered to count time for him. Morning arrives and a silver light laid over the pavement like a fine mist. He gets up earlier than usual, washes his face with cold water, runs a quick comb through his white hair, puts on a thinned coat, slips into his pocket an old pair of cloth gloves, and the chipped, still warm enamel coffee flask. The hallway is quiet, the kitchen door pulled to. He passes without leaving the chair's habitual nighttime creak. On the porch, the wind knifes cold along his neck, the smell of damp leaves and the gasoline of the early bus braided into a first-thing smell of the day. He steps into the street, hand gripping the flask's handle so it won't tap against his coat and sound. The park gate stands open, heavy but composed. Dew still beads on the grass. Each step presses down with a very soft rup, and then releases. In the small wooden management hut, yellow light falls on a corkboard clotted with clips and dried-out felt-tip pins. The woman inside wears a thick coat, her hair twisted neat at the nape, a plastic lanyard with faded letters at her throat. On the table, a small photo frame lies face down. Beside it sits a porcelain mug with a pale brown ring, long like a stripe of time. She looks up, long enough to place him, then gives a slight nod. He sets the coffee flask at the edge of the table, says his name, says I need to work, in a voice almost level with the sound of leaves out on the grounds. She does not ask his age, does not ask why, does not mention budget or paperwork. She simply turns, pulls from a corner of the tool pile a broom with a wooden handle darkened by hand sweat, and a metal litter picker whose jaws are a little misaligned. She hands him the broom. Her fingers pause a second at the roughened grip, as if to mark where to hold it firm. Not high pay, she says evenly, like noting the weather, but every morning you'll see the sun here. She lays on the table a roll of white tape and a marker. She tears off a strip, prints a short name in block letters, and sticks it to the chest of an old reflective vest she passes to him. The marker's ink is faint, the strokes pale like a voice that knows to say just enough. He takes the vest, bows his head, and, not knowing how else to thank her, puts it on right there, drawing the zipper up to his neck. Outside, the path is full of red maple leaves tangled with brown oak, the breeze just enough to turn their faces without lifting them from place. He holds the broom the right way, sets the shaft into his palm, and starts at the edge near the gate, much as he always begins from the neatest small edge of anything. The bristles whisper against the ground, swish, swish, collecting leaves into a line that curls lightly along the path. Each pull is a rounder breath. He feels the cold at his nape, slide down to his shoulders, then dissolve. Joggers slip past, their breath puffing steady, damp sweat on their collars gathering into faint streaks. An old man leads a dog. The dog stops to sniff, lifts a leg, then doesn't. The chain trembles lightly. A girl in a dark hoodie perches on the swing, sneakers pushing off the dirt. Each arc sends her silhouette flashing across a sky growing brighter. In a corner, two men set up a chessboard. The lid of the box of pieces knocks a thock on the wood. All are tenderly busy in their own ways. No one needs many words. He moves slowly on, the broom like a pen, the path a page, and each piled drift of leaves like a sentence with its period put in the right place. He stops at the stone bench by the lake and sees a small plaque screwed to the back. In memory of H.M. The screw is a little loose. The plaque shivers when the wind sweeps. He sets the broom down, takes a coin from his pocket, and tightens it. Metal rubbing metal makes a tiny rasp, then holds. He brushes the bench surface with his palm. Dust clings to his fingerprints in gray streaks he wipes on his trousers. No one told him to do it. No one sees. But the wobble has stopped. When he reaches the flower beds, he notices a small lamp at the guard hut ringed with soot, its yellow light dulled as if shining through cloth. He looks up and notes it in his head with a very fine sensation, some small thing that could make the light hold steadier. He can't reach it, but the thought sits there without words, like a pebble dropped in a pocket. The manager makes a round, a blank clipboard in hand, only stroking the curled edges of the papers. She stands a little off, watching how he sweeps. When he gathers the first heap of leaves, she silently sets down beside him a black trash bag already held open. He bends, uses the picker to clamp and lift clumps into the bag, unhurried. She moves on, her boots thup-thup over the grass, her straight back forming a steady line. In a drafty patch, her shadow and his stretch long, touch for a moment, then part, each going its own way. He sits a few minutes on the rim of the flower bed and opens the coffee flask. Warmth rises and vanishes quickly in the cold air. The mild bitterness of familiar coffee loosens his mouth after many hours held shut. He looks toward the gate where mothers are pushing strollers in turn, the wheels lightly grinding the sand. Nearby, a park trash can has a stuck lid. He tries lifting it, the hinge creaks a keek. He dots a few drops of oil from the flask cap onto it, opens and closes it a few times, and the squeak is gone. A small detail like a crease in a shirt newly smoothed. The sun slips free of the gray cloud, slants through tall trunks, and gold falls in long bars across the freshly swept path. The fine motes in the air suddenly show themselves, turn and turn, then vanish when the angle of light shifts. He stands. The patch of his back, where sweat met fabric, has started to dry. This warmth is not like the blankets last night. It comes from the hand having something to hold, the arm something to do, the eye seeing the ragged edges draw in. By the end of the morning, leaf piles half a calf high stand in rows along the path. The trash can opens and shuts without a sound. The stone bench no longer shakes. The walkway is so clean, a child's footprints print clear, small steps laid evenly. He returns to the hut, sets the broom back in the corner, exactly where it came from. The manager makes a pencil tick somewhere, then hands him a thin sheet with the work schedule and a thicker pair of rubber gloves. She looks into his eyes, not long, not short. No one says thank you. No need. The reflective vest with his name in pale ink, when the sun slants across it, shows the name clearly enough. On the way to the gate, he walks slowly, hearing his shoes on the freshly swept concrete like a sign someone leaves for himself. This morning he was here, to do something within his measure, to watch the sun come up and know he is still of use. And within that usefulness new, yet ordinary, a fine thread of an idea is touching him, that there are things within reach, small, but if you touch them in the right spot, they will steady, warm, and brighten. No praise needed, no witness needed, only that tomorrow morning he keeps going. He nodded. The motion was very small, but felt like laying the first stone on a new path. The manager turned away, leaving him with the broom, the litter picker, and the long, shimmering courtyard. Sunlight slanted through the crowns of old trees, scattering golden slices across the dew-wet path. His shadow stretched long, thin but straight, like a slender post that could still stand through a season of wind. He slipped his hands into the gloves, tested his grip on the broom handle until his fingers found the wood's calloused spot. His breath went in and out evenly, his hand's rhythm gradually sinking with the preset lines in the cement. He swept from the edges toward the middle, gathering clumps of leaves into a neat strip. With each stroke of the broom, the path reappeared like a line of writing, just wiped clean of chalk dust. Dry blades of leaves rasped against one another with a thin swish, a sound that helped his head loosen from last night's words. The chill still lay at the nape of his neck, but no longer stabbed. It slid down his shoulders and dissolved into the beading sweat behind his neck each time he bent. He realized he was counting, not counting money, not counting the days left in the month, but counting things right within reach. A loose screw tightened, a trash can lid that no longer squealed, a pile of leaves dragged to where the collection cart could dump it more easily. Each task completed gave him a small internal click, the sound of something settling into its proper notch. At the eastern flower bed, one edging brick stuck up. He pressed it down with the toe of his shoe, and the brick fit snugly, like a button after a long time finally catching the hole. Around 10 o'clock, the sunlight had withdrawn from the lawn, leaving only a thin band crawling across the wooden hut steps. He went back inside and signed his name in the blank box on the work calendar clipped up with a wooden clip. The handwriting trembled slightly, but it sat straight on the line. The black ink printed a faint mark through to the back. He blew it dry as if blowing on a spilled bit of coffee. The calendar's line, weekly schedule, had faded, but today's box stood out clearer because it had his name. A small proof, so small you could see it only up close, that he was present here in a way that needed no introduction. Back on the path, he saw an elderly woman leading her little grandson, the stroller wheels grinding over the sandy edge and cutting a zigzag. He angled the broom to ease a straight track for the wheels. The child touched the still damp stone bench. He snatched his hand back, giggling. He stepped aside, waited for them to pass, then turned to sweep the section the stroller had just sliced. No one looked at him a second time, but his strokes kept the stroller from rocking too much. There are things whose doers no one knows by name, yet they mend in the same way, quietly. By noon, he rinsed his gloves at the tap near the playground. Cold water ran through the gloves' insides, washing away the dusty brown and leaving dark folds in the fabric like handwriting. He hung the gloves on a nail to dry and wiped his face with the old square cloth he carried in his coat pocket. Sitting on the bench edge, he unscrewed the coffee thermos. The familiar smell rose up, not strong, but enough to warm his throat a little. Out on the grounds, the wind tilted the lake's surface, making even ripples. A wild duck swam, drawing a wedge-shaped wake that ran through a patch of sun and left a bright line fading away. A thought rose up without fanfare. He was not just sweeping leaves in exchange for a wage. He was petitioning to get back a stance for himself, the stance of standing upright in broad daylight, with hands busy at something useful. He had no intention of bringing the pay schedule home to set it in the middle of the table like a medal. He would not hold up any placard at all. But somehow, the neat strokes, the tightened screws, the less squeaky hinges and small corners would speak for him. I am still useful, and I will prove that not with words. He folded the cloth, put it back in his pocket, and stood up. His shadow fell slantwise along the hut wall, a thin silhouette that did not wobble. He circled the lawn once more before the shift ended to make sure no stray pile of leaves remained. In a little noticed corner, the cover of the porch light switch on the wooden hut was filmed with greasy grime, the screw a bit loose. He tightened it with a coin and wiped it with the corner of his shirt. In daylight, the light needn't be on, but when evening came, it would shine at once, without flicker. He didn't need to wait until night to see the result. It was enough to know that tonight, someone coming late would not run into the step. On the way home, he passed a hardware store. In the glass case, rows of bulbs of all sizes were arranged like glass eggs. He paused a beat, his eyes lingering on the kind with warm white printed small on the box. He read the price, did a simple sum in his head, then moved on without going in. Not yet. But the idea was already there, standing still like a door bolt freshly oiled. When he reached home, the hallway still smelled of dry wood as always. He hung the reflective jacket on a hook, rinsed the gloves in the sink to wash off the sand, wrung them out with both hands, and hung them on the window ledge to sway in the breeze. Drops fell steadily from the glove tips into a plastic pail, tick, tick, like in the evening, but without the weight of any shadow behind them. He wiped the sink again, turned the faucet mouth so it would no longer drip, pulled his chair a little out from the table and pushed it back in. Checking for a creak, there was none. Finally, he set the chipped enamel coffee thermos back in its familiar spot, but slid it farther in to leave room for tomorrow morning's cup. In the last light of the day, filtering through the kitchen window, he looked at the tabletop. Old planks, faded cup rings, the placemat smooth flat. He suddenly felt his back no longer wanted to hunch to shield anything. It only wanted to be straight enough to do small things at the right time. The rest, glances that skimmed past, whispers out in the living room, could be left to sleep outside the doorstep. Tomorrow morning, he would get up a little earlier, not to marshal words, but to line up the things his hands could touch. And with that very neatness, he would calmly write his answer, stroke by stroke of the broom, screw by screw, bulb by bulb, not to take revenge on anyone, only to set fairness back where it belongs, in a just enough light, standing still. He woke before the alarm. Cold water rinsed over his face, making the skin faintly squeak beneath his hand, alert in the way a needle touches a pulse. He put on the reflective jacket, stuffed the gloves into his pocket, and carried the chipped enamel coffee thermos that still kept a bit of warmth from the night. The alley was still dark, mist hanging like chalk dust wiping a board. At the park, with the metal gate still wet with dew, he unfolded the broom in a motion that had grown familiar. His fingers trembled, but the wooden handle lay steady in his palm. Each time he drew it across the path, the trimmer turned into a straight line. The leaves fell thin, but in great number. He did not hurry, sweeping them into curved bands along the edge of the path. Cigarette butts and candy wrappers slipped between them like little knots brushed smooth. Now and then, he paused to use the picker to grab a flat bottle cap, a strip of red ribbon someone had dropped, and put them into the black trash bag with its mouth already open. The broom's swish swish became a background refrain, wrapping his head and shoulders like a thin scarf, muffling the sounds from last night still breathing in his chest. Each time he finished a long stretch, he straightened his back and let his eyes measure the section he had just gone over. The bands of cement showed smooth, like a sentence ended exactly where it should. His breathing evened out. The tremor at his fingertips eased. At the stone bench with the memorial plaque, the screws were as tight as the day before. On the trash can lid he had oiled, the hinge opened and closed so quietly that a sparrow perched on the rim did not startle. No one noticed those small details, but inside him they turned into discreet little clicks, everything fitting. At the end of the shift, the manager handed him the envelope for his first day's pay, so thin that even clipped to the clipboard, it did not make it thicker. The sheet listing his hours was pinned beside it, the pencil strokes just dark enough. He did not count it there. He nodded and slipped the envelope into his inner pocket. Where there was a faulty seam, he had once stitched himself, the thread now grayed like his hair. At home, no one had yet come down to the kitchen. Early light poured through the doorway, a long strip of sun hitting the table's edge and rolling onto the glass jar in the middle. The jar turned out to be larger than he remembered, with a thick rim. On its side lingered the traces of a label that had been peeled away, specks of glue left behind. Inside, a few coins rolled about in their loneliness. In the middle lay a small bill folded into quarters from the last time. He set the coffee thermos in the corner, slipped a bit of tissue under its base so it would not leave a mark, then took out the envelope. The edge of the paper was lightly frayed. The faint clack of the staple as he pried it off was very soft. He took out a few bills, not many, with the faint stale scent of bank ink. He smoothed them on the table mat, ran a finger along the edges so the creases would lie flat. He did not leave them as a stack. He plucked one, folded it into a narrow strip, and tucked it beneath the layer of coins, letting a corner poke out, as if by accident. Another he wedged between the lid and the glass, right where the old glue still clung. It looked like a small note someone had absent-mindedly tucked there. The rest he left in the envelope, resealed it with the very staple he had just removed, and put it deep in a drawer so that if anyone in the house saw it, they would think it was an unopened letter. By the time his daughter-in-law came down to boil water, he was wiping the window ledge with a cloth folded in quarters. She passed the jar, her eyes pausing for a second on the corner of the bill sticking out, while the sound of water beginning to boil droned in the kettle. In the living room, his son flipped to the reminder to pay the internet bill. The phone's ting. When the charge was confirmed, sounded as clear as a drop falling into the quiet. No one asked. If they looked at each other, the look stopped at assumptions. Maybe an electricity rebate. Maybe change someone got back yesterday. Maybe somewhere that wasn't him. He kept wiping the sill, hiding a thin smile in the twist of the cloth. The days took on that evenness. Each morning, the park brought home a little weariness and a little money. Before anyone woke, he opened the jar and slipped in a few small bills, or turned loose change into a larger bill by gathering it up. He never kept the money in a stack. He liked to scatter it like incidental scraps. One bill wedged under the rim of the jar, one slipped between the gas and electric bills his daughter-in-law had laid aside, a coin pressed beneath the base of the salt and pepper shakers. From a distance, the kitchen showed no sign of a hand seeking recognition. Up close, the slanting sunlight made the edges of paper throw up a thin rim of light, as if someone had just marked a line nearing its due date. Some days he deliberately washed his scent off the bills, the brush of his hem, once enough for the smell of detergent to drown out the ink. Some days he clipped a bill to an invoice already paid, where the word paid was faint, as if the post office had mistakenly sent back a little change. He thought, if self-respect had a shape, it would likely look like this glass jar transparent, standing in the center of the home, without a label. Everyone could see it, and no one needed to read the name of the person who put things in. In the evening, when his son gathered the bills, once he glanced at the jar, muttered something to his wife, put his hand on the glass lid, and then pulled it back, leaving it as it was. The next morning, he dropped in a few coins from his pocket. Their cheerful clinking was oddly pleasing. The old man witnessed this from the doorway of the last room down the hall, his hand still on the cloth at the windowsill, feeling his own tremor turn light, like a speck of dust just lifting off the glass. On rainy days, he came home earlier, his coat freckled with wet, water dripping onto the kitchen floor in streaks. He stood in the doorway, shook the coat straight, and dabbed up each drop so no one would slip. At such moments, the glass jar caught the light more than anything else in the kitchen, as if someone had poured a thin layer of honey into it. He loosened the lid slightly to prevent condensation inside, wiped the rim of old glue clean as if wiping away a sooty memory. The wall clock's ticking blended with the rain, steady. Between those beats, the soft rustle of bills shifting in the jar sounded like breathing. Sometimes at noon, the kitchen smelled of reheated noodles and hand soap. His daughter-in-law passed, peeling the label from a milk carton, her hand brushing the jar so it turned a little. She straightened the sugar label on the jar beside it so it lined up with the money jar. That small order, the money jar beside the sugar jar, the spoon tray between, looked like a family posing for a photograph, each member keeping just enough distance, no one leaning on anyone else. He did not tell anyone his wage, nor did he say that his hand had steadied thanks to holding the broom handle regularly. Each day he added just a little to the jar, enough for a bill to be paid a bit early, or a better bottle of cooking oil, or a timely box of cold medicine. That sense of just enough was like when he swept leaves to the edge of a flower bed. Sweep more and the earth would bear its roots. Sweep less and the wind would scatter them again. He placed the money right at that rim of enough. At night, on his way through the living room to turn off the TV, he paused to look at the porch light flickering through the curtain. The yellow blinked like tired eyelids. He touched the switch, then drew his hand back, leaving it as it was. Back in the kitchen, he opened the jar, the glass touching the glass mouth with a very soft keet. A small sound, but a confirmation that someone was still attending to things that made no sound. He folded another bill and let it fall in. The lid settled quiet. His hand rested on it for a second, then withdrew, leaving no warmth behind. The morning after that, the park was full of leaves again. He swept again, gathered again, heard again the discreet clicks of the screws he had oiled. At home, the glass jar stood in the middle of the kitchen like a small well of light, filling each day not with money but with a way of living, helping without a signature. And at the edge of his thoughts, where no one's gaze reached, another task waited its turn, the task of a porch light that had yet to stay steady. But today he would only do today's part, small, even quiet things placed where they belong. That afternoon, he walked past the hardware store as he did every day, but this time he stopped. In the glass case, boxes of light bulbs were lined up straight. The small print read, "Warm White, 9W, 2700K." He chose a box that wasn't the cheapest, but not expensive either, his finger tracing the dented edge of the cardboard. The clerk handed him a receipt as thin as a sticky note, the ink still wet. He folded it in half and slipped it into his wallet, where the old photo of three people once standing under this very porch lived. The leftover coins clinked in his jacket pocket, a sound as light as sparse rain. Back home, the kitchen was empty, the noon smell of frying oil still lingering on the curtains. The TV in the living room talked about gas prices and then switched to the weather forecast. He went straight to the door, opened the porch, and heard the hinge rasp a thin note. On the porch ceiling, the old bulb hung inside a glass shade filled with soot, blinking now and then like tired eyelids. He set the box on the step, dragged out the low plastic stool, and tested its steadiness by planting one foot. The stool did not wobble. He took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and wrapped the old handkerchief around the bulb to keep it from slipping. His hand touched the cold glass. He turned counterclockwise in quarter turns, hearing a very soft click as the metal threads released. The old bulb came down feather-light into his hand, its threaded base stained black. He laid it on the cloth, as if setting down something once familiar that had come time to return. He reached up and with the corner of his shirt whisked the layer of soot from the shade. The dust fell like a thin mist, and when he blew, it dispersed like smoke. The new bulb came out of the box with a milky white body and pale gray lettering. He raised it, turned it in the proper direction. The threads caught after the second turn. His hand kept time, tightening just until his wrist itself felt enough. He lowered himself and reached for the switch by the door frame. A tack. The light came on, flared slightly for a beat, then gentled, warm gold settling as if honey were poured over wood. The glass shade shone with a clean circle, no flicker. He stood still, his eyes not yet adjusted, until the step clearly showed the little chip along its lowest edge, the very nick that made anyone coming home late catch a toe each night. He looked up again, checking the threads with one light touch, just to be sure. Then he wiped both hands on his pant legs, the faint smudge printed on the washed-out blue, like an anonymous signature. Inside the house, the sound of a spoon touched the side of a bowl and then went quiet. Out on the street, wind brushed the roofline and a tiny bell rang a solitary ting, its note sinking at once into the new gold light. The light spread down the steps in an even trapezoid, stretching to the edge of the yard and then fading into the tree's shade. It slipped into the small seams between the tiles, cast a soft halo on the wood of the door. Even the flaked paint at the corner seemed less coarse. The path from the gate to the house, usually dark early, suddenly looked as if it had been redrawn with a steady pen. He stepped back one tread, stood at the rim of the light, the gentle warmth on the backs of his hands, and then walked into that light to check once more. No flicker, no dimming, only stillness. He flattened the empty bulb box and tucked it into his inner pocket. He didn't throw the old bulb into the kitchen trash. He put it in the small cabinet under the sink to take out on the proper garbage day. He turned back in and flipped the switch. The light went off. He flipped it again. The light came on. 2 checks like 2 nods to himself. He didn't call anyone to see. He just stood off to the side within the doorway, watching the light wrap the outline of his plastic sandals. Feeling the way in and out suddenly spoke a new language, enough to see, not enough to dazzle. When his son passed through the hall, he glanced toward the porch, squinted at the unfamiliar brightness, then turned back to his stack of papers. His daughter-in-law brought out a small trash bag, stopped on the top step, and looked down at the chipped tread, now clear. She hesitated a beat, then stepped slowly, her foot not catching. She lifted her eyes for a second, as if to determine why everything had become easier. The golden light wrapped half her face. The angles of the house looked less sharp. No one asked anyone anything. He shifted aside to let her pass, his hand brushing the air of the newly lit porch, both warm and dry. He drew the door closed, leaving the porch light outside and the kitchen's gentle dark inside, the two separated by an invisible border. On the table, the glass jar stood quiet, a bill's edge sticking out just enough to catch the light. The porch light didn't reach this far, but the warmth from the doorway seemed to slide low across the floor. He set the chipped enamel coffee thermos back in its familiar corner, turned the handle to point at 3 o'clock, then made a round of the kitchen just to check if any corner needed wiping. Nothing did just now. He went back out to the porch and leaned against the post, feeling his back straighter when he stood within the light. Evening deepened. The bulb's thin gold met the blue of dusk, crossing in the air just before the steps. Tiny insects came, circled for a while, then thinned out, as if they knew their bounds. The alleyway darkened. Other doorways clicked on their lights one by one. But the light on his porch today did not blink. It held steady, hugging the chipped edge of the step like a hand placed exactly where it should be. Within that stillness, the distance between the person in the kitchen and the person in the yard, between the speaker and the listener, shrunk by a fraction. Not much, not showy. Just enough that whoever came home late would not miss a step. Whoever left early would not grope in the dark. He touched his pocket and felt the folded receipt, the rough edge of paper brushing his skin. He smoothed it as one smooths a crease in the chest. Then he turned the light off, and on one last time before going in, the gold held steady again, as promised. He gave a slight nod, wiped his hands once more on his trouser legs, leaving no trace. Behind him, the door pulled to a notch. Quiet. Outside, the light remained, keeping watch over the step and over a distance that had just been eased. Evening sank slowly, the cold seeping up from the roadway into the brick edges. His car pulled to the curb, the engine off, the faint whir under the hood like a half-finished breath. He stepped out, his breath turning to a thin mist before his face. On the porch, the new bulb cast a gentle band of gold, steady as if it had been there forever. His father sat on the step, back resting lightly against the post, the chipped enamel coffee thermos set by his knee, the lid not fully tightened, so a damp, warm warmth hovered around the mouth. He rubbed his palms together once, then stopped. The jingle of keys in his hands suddenly sounded too loud. He started to pocket them, then kept them cupped to stop the clatter. The chipped corner on the lowest tread showed starkly under the light. There was no dark left for it to hide in. The gold fell across the backs of his father's cracked hands, showing even the fine scratch along the thumb where the old bulb's threads must have scraped. He did not look up. His head was slightly bowed, his eyes set somewhere between the step and his plastic sandals. Steam from the coffee rose in a thin strand, touched his chin, then vanished. He paused at the foot of the steps and looked up at the bulb. The light did not flicker. The glass shade was clean. The threaded rim did not wobble. He reached up and touched the lip of the shade, very lightly, just to check. His fingertip warmed at once, like a small reminder. Someone had been here before him, done this so he could come home late and not stumble. The porch door opened, the hinge giving a thin squeak. He stepped inside. The day's kitchen smells lingered, old frying oil and detergent. On the table, the glass jar stood in the center, its side catching a strip of light that had slipped in from the porch. Inside, a few freshly crumpled bills were wedged over some coins, discreet but impossible to miss. One corner of a bill stuck out past the rim, caught on the old label glue, as if someone had tucked it there in absent-minded haste. He lingered longer than necessary. The refrigerator clicked into a new cycle. A draft sighed through the vent. In his head, a quick chain of guesses. A rebate, someone's change, some refund. But his eyes dropped to the cloth folded in quarters beside the jar, the neat fold his father used, then to the smudged streak like a fingerprint on the back of the jar, the kind of grime from the park, then to the thermos on the porch with its lid still open, the kind of unhurried open that was his father's. Quietly, everything pointed in the same direction. He heard his own footsteps on the tile sounding too loud. His hand set on the jar lid, turned it a little, then stopped, not opening it. With one more twist, he would know the smell of new inked bills inside, and know for sure which hand had just touched them. But he did not twist. He drew his hand back and set it on the table, his fingertips still carrying the leftover scent of office hand sanitizer from the afternoon, a kind of sterile helplessness. The porch door pulled itself to a notch, and the gold wrapped the threshold again. He turned back outside. His father still sat there, his back neither hunched to block the wind nor stiffened in waiting. He simply sat like a part of the porch's architecture, born to be there and able to disappear without anyone noticing. His hands had left the thermos and lay palms up on his knees, pale blue veins raised like little canals. His plastic sandals were set parallel, toes pointing toward the yard, a posture fit either for going on or for staying. He sat on the step above, a space between them exactly the width of a hand. The light spread over the porch, and for an instant their shadows doubled each other and then parted, like two lines written over one another and then each finding its own rule again. A breeze slipped through. The small bell at the eaves trembled. He reached out, did not quite touch, drew back, and set his hand on his thigh. The gesture fell into the space between them, making no sound. From the kitchen, drops fell from the faucet. Tick, tick, clear in the quiet house. Each drop fell like a weight on an unsaid word. He thought of the sentence at dinner a few nights earlier, the word mouth skidding across the bowl's glaze, sharper than intended. Then he thought of the bulb, a light that stands still, warm and sufficient, never asking to be named. Then he thought of the crumpled bills in the jar, appearing just when needed, without anyone stepping forward to claim them. Those thoughts passed through him like cold wind, not cutting the skin, but taking away the last layer of warmth. A breath of warmth lifted from the thermos lid, brushed the edge of the step at his knee. He bent and without thinking tightened the lid. A simple movement, but when he looked up, he caught that his father's hand had already withdrawn into his sleeve so he wouldn't have to touch it. A small distance had just been kept for him, even without anyone asking. Shame rose, not the kind that wants to apologize quickly and be done, but the kind that wants to sit one step lower, in the right place. He glanced at his father. The old man's eyelids were half closed, as if listening to the wind. The corner of his mouth formed neither a smile nor a droop, just a quiet straight line that made a person careful with any word about to come out. He looked back at the light. It neither took credit nor demanded recognition. It simply did the work of light, showed the way for hurried feet, tucked away the small dark hollows at the edge of the steps. He set the bunch of keys on the step. Metal met cement with a ting, too small to be called an apology, but enough to say he was there. Inside, the glass jar stood still at the center of the table, the fresh bills tucked in like dry leaves someone had just gathered in the park. On the porch, the two men sat within a light that was enough, looking in the same direction. No one spoke. And in his chest, a layer slid down like dust on a lampshade just brushed away, revealing a feeling heavy yet clear. Shame. It sat quietly, the size of a palm, did not break, only remained. He let it remain, the way he let the light remain. He stood in the kitchen, his hand resting on the lid of the glass jar. The cool glass seeped through his skin. Golden light from the porch fell diagonally across the table, catching a bright line along the back of his hand, bringing out the scratches hidden among the tendons. Inside, a few crumpled bills brushed softly against one another as his breath touched the glass, fogging it for a moment and then clearing. The refrigerator shifted cadence, the fan humming steadily like a small, patient machine. He said nothing. His thumb turned the lid a touch. It gave a tiny keet and then stayed still. He didn't open it. Beside the jar lay a cloth folded in quarters, its corner biting lightly into the table's edge, an arrangement too familiar to fade into the background. His eyes slid past the faint smudge on the back of the jar, a handprint carrying the park's dust, and out to the porch. The light still stood steady, holding the chipped step in a warm trapezoid, leaving slim bands of darkness on either side as if carefully measured. He let out a long breath. The draft from the fridge vent brushed his collar, the kind of chill a house has at day's end. On the table, the keyring lay askew, the metal hook pressed into the wood in a small dent. He picked up the keys and set them aside, leaving the space between the jar and the table's edge empty, as if clearing a passage for a thought that had not yet found its name. From farther off, drops from the faucet ticked evenly, tick, tick, each one tapping at an invisible circle around him. He tipped the jar a little. The bills inside slid slowly, their corners scraping the glass with a soft rustle, like clothes brushing together on the porch. At the rim, where old label glue still clung, a corner of a bill stuck out. He nudged it in with his fingertip, hiding it, a motion so slight he hardly felt it himself. His fingers held the scent of hand sanitizer, scrubbed clean and cold, unable to drown the faint coffee smell that still drifted from the thermos on the step. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He pulled it out, the white screen reflected off the jar, laying a second light over it, thin and cold. On the screen was an empty box for typing. He stood still, let the cursor blink for a long moment, then locked the screen and set the phone face down beside the cloth. In the instant the phone went dark, the porch's gold took the space back, covered the tabletop, and smoothed the last of its sharp, cold edges. He looked toward the porch. His father still sat there, his shoulders swallowed by the old coat, the coffee thermos set by his knee. His hands lay quiet on his thighs, opened like an upturned bowl, asking nothing. The light wrapped his face in a flat, warm halo, neither showy nor lacking. No more wavering shadows, no more squeaking hinge. A small order had been put into its proper place, without a name. His hand on the jar lid grew heavy. He felt his skin warm where the slanted light warmed the glass, and cool where the kitchen draft touched it. Two patches of temperature that did not meet, like two people separated by a door left ajar. He lifted his hand from the lid. A damp ring blurred and then disappeared. He passed the edge of the cloth over it, not to clean, but to let a gesture stand in for words. After a while, he drew his chair close to the table. The chair legs slid over the tiles so softly it was almost soundless. Someone must have oiled them. He sat, tried resting his elbows on the table's edge, then drew them back, fingers interlaced. The gold visited his cheek, holding half his face. The other half sank into the kitchen's gentle dark. He kept that posture until the wind chime at the eaves rang faintly, an old irritation he'd once mistaken for a loose nail, now a small cue to stand. He stood. His hand touched the jar once more, as if greeting a silent piece of evidence. He took his phone, picked up the keys, and set them neatly on the tray by the sink. Then he turned toward the porch door. With each step across the patch of light on the tiles, his shadow drew in and stretched out, like a cord learning how to slacken. He reached the door, took the handle, and turned it a notch. The frame opened just enough for the gold to spill across his chest. He stood there half a beat, his eyes meeting his father's, not directly at a midpoint, warm and hard to speak within. He exhaled softly. His breath vanished into the light. Then he turned back into the house. The door eased back, the wood edge meeting the jamb in silence. No squeak, only the tongue of the lock finding its groove, light as a nod. The porch light remained, holding the chipped step. In the kitchen, the glass jar returned to the gentle dark, but the glass kept a trace of warmth where his hand had rested. He walked farther into the house, unhurried. Behind him, the old man sat in a just enough circle of gold, the coffee thermos still warm, and the distance between the two of them, tonight, was eased by a door closed and still. Night cinched tight like a cold ribbon. The dark kitchen held only the thin streak of light from the microwave clock, too, pale green digits blinking 02 on qual, then 201. The refrigerator sighed once and fell silent. When every sound had dropped to its smallest, the phone on the table buzzed softly, the vibration like an insect caught on the rim of a glass. He opened his eyes, not startled. His fingers groped for the tabletop, touched the cool glass, lifted the phone. The screen flared, cold white light washing over the knobby joints of his thin fingers, revealing pale blue veins. The message sat in the middle of the screen, simply, "The porch light is steady now. Thank you." No emoji, no extra period, just two clauses, standing side by side like two bricks that have found their footing. He looked for a long time. The eye's little cursor seemed to settle on the word steady, a word seldom used for anything that belonged to him. The light from the porch did not quite enter the kitchen. It only sent through the crack of the door a thin golden band that touched the table leg and stopped. He drew the thin blanket from his shoulders, sat up, and brought the phone closer. The warm metal and plastic smell of the device sank into his hand, calling up the feel of the wooden broom handle that morning, resting snug in his palm. Somewhere between those two sensations, a very soft knock in his chest slowed. He set the phone down, the screen still lit. He pulled the chipped enamel coffee thermos closer and opened the lid. The remaining warmth lifted in a faint strand, skimmed the back of his hand and his chin, not hot enough to heat, but enough to ease the vessels beneath the skin from contracting. He tipped the thermos. The coffee struck the cup with soft tack, tack. Sounds like light rain falling on a distant tin roof. His hand, still carrying a fine thread of tremor, kept the pour steady, the very thing he had done all day with leaves, with screws, with the chipped step. He sat down, setting the cup a little off-center on the placemat, leaving a space for the phone beside it. In that space, the words of the message lay still. He tapped the reply field. The cursor blinked like someone standing on a threshold. He typed, "Okay," deleted it, typed, "I know," deleted it, typed a period, then deleted that too. Each time the letters appeared and vanished, the tabletop returned to smoothness, no ink mark, like a pond that does not keep the trace of a stone just thrown. Outside on the porch, the light stood steadier than any sentence he was about to write. That gold didn't urge or beckon. It simply did its part, soaking into the steps, laying over the small chip like a transparent bandage. He turned his head toward the door and let his eyes rest on the edge of a light. The door hinge did not squeak. Someone, also him, had oiled it. The small things had come to rest. He took a sip. The thin bitterness faded quickly, leaving warmth in his throat, spreading across his chest like a scarf laid the right way. He set the cup back in the exact spot, turned the handle to 3 o'clock to remember. On the table, the glass jar stood at the edge of his sight. Its side caught a tiny shard of gold, like a small flame trapped in water. The crumpled bills inside stayed put under the weight of the lid, needing no one to count them. The phone dimmed from lack of touch until the screen turned itself off, leaving the kitchen in a gentle dark. He did not turn on a light. He wanted the porch light to do the speaking. Outside, the night's small sounds, distant cars, a light draft, the wind chime tilting, accepted falling beneath the light. He laid his palm on the table and felt a thin warmth left by the cup seeping into his skin, like a sentence forming that needed no words. He picked up the phone once more and read the message again. His thumb settled on the reply button, then stayed. If he replied, he would only blur what the night had already made plain for him, that something had just been noticed without fanfare. He set the phone face down, the glass touching the wood with a small thump, like the latch of a thought just closed. He stood and eased the kitchen door open. The porch light poured in a little more, swallowing the dark along the rug's edge. The chipped step was clear, the handrail clean of soot, the glass shade quietly bright. He didn't step out. He just stood there, letting the warm gold pass over his sandals. Night air slipped into his trouser cuffs, the cold breaking into little grains and then thinning when it met the light. Back at the table, he poured another half cup, dividing what remained in the thermos between his night self and his morning self, a surprisingly strict habit. He drew the chair close to the table, sat upright, and cupped the mug in both hands, letting the heat warm all 10 fingertips. In the corner, the frame of his late wife's photo caught a sliver of gold sliding in and stopping on her cheek through the glass. He nodded lightly to that streak of light, as one nods to someone who understands silence. The message would not be answered right away. He left it there as he had left a screw less loose, a trash can lid less squeaky, a light less prone to flicker. Let the light speak for him. Let his son, passing the porch on some later night, hear for himself the sentence, "I'm still here, doing my part." And if another message came, it would arrive like grains of light falling softly on the steps, with no urging. He lifted the cup again. Coffee vapor beaded on the microwave clock's glass, fogging the 2 digits for a moment, and then clearing. 2:13. He pressed the phone's mute, set it a little off-center on the table-making room for the porch's wordless light. Then he sat still, listening to the night go by, like someone stepping softly across a wooden floor, plank by plank. On the steps, the gold held, like a reply already sent, legible to the eyes of one's feet. He left the rest, the answers in words for the morning or for some day when they would no longer be needed. He unscrewed the thermos lid, a thin breath of coffee rising like a placid thread of smoke. On the table, the placemat lay smooth since the evening, its edge hugging the familiar wooden rim. He took 2 porcelain cups. One he set before himself, one he slid toward the chair opposite, the chair long left empty, its back lightly touching the wall like someone sitting upright. He poured his own cup first, listening to the liquid strike, the ceramic tack, then poured a half cup for the other chair. Warmth gathered into a faint halo over the empty cup and slipped into the cold night air. Out on the porch, the new bulb stood firm, its gentle gold like a laid-out cloth of light. A warm trapezoid fell across the chipped step, sweeping over the little nick that now looked like a deliberate crease. Wind slipped along the eaves and tipped the wind chime. The sound dissolved at once inside the light. No flicker, no squeak. The light simply stayed there, enough to rest the eyes, steady the feet. He nudged the cup for the empty chair a bit farther forward, turning its handle outward as if awaiting a late hand. No one was needed. That half cup was only a gesture to hold a place for what had fallen quiet, giving the blank space a clear shape without weight. He raised his own cup and sipped. The thin bitterness ran down his throat and spread across his chest like a just enough blanket. The silence in the kitchen was not something pressing down. It was like the air between 2 breaths, a pause for a thought to pass through without bumping into the furniture. He glanced out to the porch. The clean glass shade stamped a thin ring of light on the leaves at the yard's edge. On the lower tread, the patch of dirt people often stepped on was less dark. The way into the house looked redrawn with a fine-tipped pin. He thought of the mornings in the park, the screws tightened, the trash can lids no longer squealing, the piles of leaves gathered all ways of placing order into a place of lack. The cup set on the empty chair was the same, a small order for feeling, so it wouldn't spill into the walkway. On the refrigerator, the bill pinned under an apple magnet sat straight. At the lower corner was his faint pencil mark, a line striking through today. The glass jar in the middle of the table caught a sliver of light from the porch. The crumpled bills inside were as quiet as leaves already lying still in the park. He didn't touch the lid. His hands wrapped around the cup kept all 10 fingertips warm, the pale blue veins easing. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and dry wood. The microwave clock changed numbers slowly, a soft blink like someone nodding. He leaned back a little in the chair, back straight enough, chin lowered to hear clearly the night going by. Distant cars, wind murmuring through the trees, a stray bark at the far end of the street. Those sounds did not call up loneliness as they usually did. They were only a backdrop for the porch's patch of light doing its work. The steam from the other cup thinned. He poured himself another half cup and tipped a little of what was left in the thermos into the empty cup, so it wouldn't go completely cold. Not to wait for someone to come in, only to keep the idea of there is a place from going out. The handle still faced outward. If someone came home late, they could fit their hand there without stumbling. He stood and drew the kitchen door in a notch so the porch light could slip in a bit more, just enough to soften the dark along the table's edge. The step outside glowed steadily, the little chip like a brief rest in an even piece of music. He suddenly thought of the text just now, two plain clauses needing no ornament. The cup on the empty chair was his reply. Set down, left there, no exclamation point, no quotation marks. He returned to the table, turned his own cup's handle to point at 3 o'clock, and with the other hand smoothed the placemat's edge flat. The frame of his wife's photo on the side table caught a slice of gold, skimming across her cheek behind the glass and moving on. He gave a slight nod, as if greeting someone who had just passed by the door. On the floor, the strip of light from the porch slid to his feet and stopped at the edge of his sandals. He slipped his feet out and set his bare sole on the tile, warm by a thin layer, the cold retreated by a notch. From the doorway, a light breeze lifted the edge of the curtain. The gold trembled for half a beat and then held. Somewhere his son might come home late once more. Or not. It didn't matter. The bulb had been tightened. The step had its line. The cup on the empty chair was warm enough for a person to imagine himself invited. He sat down, cupped the mug in both hands, and let his eyes rest on the stream of light pooling on the floor, his heart oddly at ease. No victory was proclaimed, no verdict read, yet justice in its smallest shape stood right outside the door, a light that kept its word, a step that did not trip, a seat that did not demand. He took the last sip and set the cup exactly where a round, damp ring had marked it. Then he left the two cups as they were, one carrying breath, one carrying warmth, like two ellipses in a story that had found its ordinary rhythm. On the porch, the bulb still stood steady. The thin gold held the way enough that the late returner wouldn't fall, enough that the early leaver wouldn't be dazzled. Inside, the empty chair opposite still kept a half cup set out, not to call anyone back, but to remind that from here on, each person can step through his own dark without waking anyone with the sound of a mistake. In the end, no one demanded an explanation from anyone. Only a porch stood golden late into the night. A hinge no longer squeaked. A step bore weight without complaint. The old coffee thermos changed places, from the father's hand to a corner of the son's kitchen shelf. The 2:13 a.m. text lay still like a small pin on memory. The porch light is steady now. Thank you. If you call that revenge, it's the gentlest kind of reprisal, refusing to buy closeness, returning silence to where silence belongs, and patiently fixing what lies within reach, a light bulb, a hinge, a step, so someone else can pass through without being woken by the sound of a mistake. Justice served needs no verdict. It becomes a still golden light and a breath less hurried. If you've ever chosen silence instead of arguing, ever stepped back but still left something sufficient for someone else, tell it with one small detail in the comments. A bulb you once changed, a cup of coffee you set out, a text sent at 2:13 a.m. Just one detail, no explanation needed, so we can recognize one another in the very small lights, enough that no one stumbles on their own threshold anymore.